I'm Dr. Viv Jones, and James asked me today to provide a taster lecture for you. So I'm going to start sharing my screen and let's have a look at mud and why it might matter. Why mud matters, what lake sediments can tell us about the past and environmental change, and hopefully convince you that this is an important thing and a current thing to look at in Okay, so I just wanted to start off with a little bit about myself. As you can see from the top right there, I spent a long parts of my childhood looking at streams. Here I am doing a bit of fishing while my cousins and my brother were playing with stones, but kind of developed a lifelong interest in freshwater ecology, especially actually working in quite cold environments, in the Arctic environments in particular, but I've also worked in Antarctica, I've worked in Greenland, in Svalbard, and up in Arctic Russia, where you can see me up there taking a core from a frozen lake and then sectioning it there in the bottom. So I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about what paleolimnology means and how we use that. So paleolimnology is the study of past conditions in a lake, and that's provided by the evidence from these lake muds that we collect from the bottom of the lake. We assume that that mud is put down in a sequential way, and we can test that using things like lead-210 and carbon-14 on naturally occurring radioisotopes. So we have our current conditions, which you can see there at the top of the core, and then as we go down the core, we're going back further in time in the past, and then we can analyse things like fossil remains or elemental remains to give us an idea of ecological and chemical change. And why do you want to do that? Well, we want to do that to look at how lakes respond to different pressures. So we might be interested in things like acidification or nutrient enrichment, sometimes called eutrophication, or indeed climate change. We might want to look at how a lake responds to different management strategies. We can do that by looking at, for example, how a lake has reacted to a land use change in the past. And then we can look at the reference conditions at the base of the core. So these are the more pristine conditions at the base of the core. These might be baseline or reference conditions, and we can use those to look at things like restoration goals or restoration targets. And these are all appropriate questions and interests for conservation groups. So if we think about how humans have impacted on lake ecosystems, we can look at these potential drivers or forces of change, and these range in the importance in terms of timescales from things that are really only important perhaps for the last 100 years or even the last few decades, things like plastics or persistent organic pollutants, which are obviously anthropogenically made, but then there are a whole range of different drivers that go back perhaps thousands of years, things like habitat disturbance. We know that for example, humans have affected lake ecosystems through removal of vegetation from a catchment, through catchment burning, through deforestation over thousands of years. So this is an attempt to sort of look at the timescales that we look at in our paleolimnology, and also the drivers, and that helps us understand that. By understanding the past, that helps us to understand the present and predict what might happen into the future. And we're obviously looking at fresh waters here, and these are really important for a couple of, I guess, main reasons. Firstly, fresh waters are very heavily impacted by habitat change and biodiversity loss. So this graph here is showing the loss in biodiversity in freshwater systems, which have lost about 83% of their biodiversity since the 1970s. So these have been very impacted systems, and we've also lost a great number of those. And secondly, of course, we know that we all need fresh water to survive. We need it for drinking water, but we also need it for the ecosystem services that fresh waters provide. So things like providing of food, but also flood mitigation is another important ecosystem service. So there's very good reasons why we're interested in lakes and how they're responding to these different drivers of change. But today, as I said before, I'm just going to look at a couple of actually one example, looking at the Buick swan in Arctic Russia. We've been working with conservation organisations for a number of years, but one of these is the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, and they're interested in a waterfowl. We've had projects looking at the common scoter in the flow countries, the Madagascan pochard in Madagascar, and the Buick swan, as I mentioned. And we can use our lake sediments to look at targets for conservation. We can use those to disentangle these multiple stresses, because if these stresses occur at different time intervals, we can start to separate them. But equally, we can look at the interactions between those stresses, and we can use these to identify feedbacks and lags in our systems. And it's important to use our lake sediment approaches in much of this work, because we just don't have the monitoring data available, especially in some of these very remote habitats up in the Arctic. So how do we go about doing this? Clearly this isn't Arctic Russia, but we firstly start off by going out into the lake and collecting sediment cores. Here's just an example of doing that with some students up in Hampstead Ponds, when we teach our second year past environments course. The students take some cores, and here they are again in the right hand side, extruding that core, pushing it up and sampling that core. So once we have our sediment slices, we can look at the plant and animal remains that are then preserved in those sediment slices. So I just want to give you a couple of examples of what those look like. First of all, this is a Cara oospore. So this is a macroalgae that encysts these calcareous remains. So very good indicators of high alkalinity water, but also very clear water. Then we have things like diatoms. So on the right there is some live diatoms showing their chloroplasts, and on the left an SEM of a dead diatom. These have very ornamented shells made of silica. They preserve well in our lake sediments, and actually that's the thing that I actually use in my own research to look at past environmental change. They're very good at telling us about past pH, past conductivity, and past nutrient levels. And then we have our zoological remains, so things like fish scales, which are shown there. And this is a perch scale. Non-biting midge remains, for example, shown here. These are very good at looking at past temperatures. They have a very clear specific tolerance for different temperatures. And then other organisms such as bryozoans, which provide these resting stages, again, which can tell us about the clarity of the water. So we're looking at different components of the ecosystem. We're starting to rebuild food webs, for example. So looking at the Buick swan in particular, this is sometimes called the tundra swan. It's Britain's smallest swan species. It's really a fascinating creature because you can actually identify individuals. If you look on the left hand there, you can see that the bills of those different birds are actually very different. So you're actually able to identify individuals and trace individuals, a bit like a fingerprint, for example. But we know from that sort of information, and also population counts, that the populations of these individuals have decreased in Britain and also in the Republic of Ireland over the last 30 or 40 years. So there's been a decline in these, and we don't really know why that's happened. So what could the drivers of that be? So these birds breed up in the high Arctic. That red or magenta sort of colour is their breeding grounds. They breed there, they raise their broods there and feed there in the summer. And then they have these migratory pathways. And what's shown there is the western one, which is moving to places like Slimbridge or the Ouse Washes over the winter, where again they feed on vegetation. So there could be a number of different drivers of that observed population decline. There could be changes along the migratory pathways. There could be changes due to predators and prey, and there could be competition changes. There could be diseases. So we can't really say much about that from our paleo work, but we can perhaps look at the climate change in that area, and we can also look at the changes in those breeding sites themselves to see what environmental change has happened. So we went out into the field, and here we are up in the high Russian Arctic in the Pechora Delta, taking our sediment cores. In the centre there's a short sediment core which we then brought back to the lab, and were able to date using lead-210. And what did we find in that sediment core? So this is actually two lakes here. They just got codes, they haven't got names. So Nari 2 and Nari 2.1 and Nari 10.1. But what's interesting here is really the changes on the left-hand side of both of those graphs, this change in the different zooplankton. So what we're having is a decrease in a very large zooplankton species called Daphnia pulex, and an increase in a smaller Daphnia species. At Nari 10, we've also got some other changes at the top. We have some increases in aquatic macrophytes, such as lemna, and also increases in some of the mollusk species. So there are ecosystem changes going ahead here, and they also seem to be, the direction of those seems to be quite similar in terms of those two sites. We've actually looked at far more sites than that, but this is just looking at 4 of these, and we have a lot of information. We have a lot of species information that's perhaps quite difficult to show, quite difficult to interpret. But if we do these these are sort of ordinations, that's trying to put all this species information into a couple of dimensions to make it easier to interpret. So on the left we have a ordination for the macrofossils, and on the right an ordination for the diatoms. So I think you can see for the macrofossils, certainly, we have at the bottom of the core, which is a dark circle, a filled in circle, and the top of the core is the white circle. And we can kind of see this unidirectional change. So we have 4 sites, 4 different sites, but they're all kind of moving in the same space in terms of their species changes. Which gives us some confidence that these changes are not just unique to a particular site, but that they're regional changes. But then if we look at some of the components of the ecosystem, the diatoms, for example, there's changes, there are still changes, but they're much more kind of random and less directional in their nature. So it can get these quite complicated signals. But what we do have, I think, is strong evidence for aquatic ecosystem reconfiguration up in the Arctic. We've been able to use other information, like, for example, mercury pollution levels, to show that perhaps the pollution really doesn't appear to be a consideration here. And we also have been able to show that sea level, which can be shown quite nicely by the diatoms, again hasn't been a likely driver of change. So what we're left with really is that what we think is happening is these lakes are actually becoming hydrologically much more connected. There are fish moving between the lakes, and these fish are predating on the zooplankton, and that's causing this change from these large zooplankton species to these small zooplankton species. How that affects the Buick swan is a little bit more difficult to say, but perhaps there are also changes we can see in those diagrams that are to do with aquatic macrophytes, which may be a more direct food source. There could be some competition for food, again, between the birds and the fish. But there also seems to be a role of climate here, and so it's actually quite difficult to, in this case, disentangle between those 2 drivers of change. So we're still working on this. This is work in progress, and hopefully I'll be trying to write this up over the summer. So I hope I've shown, with just one example here, looking at biodiversity changes, why mud matters. We can use this kind of approach in many different ways to look at questions related to climate change, to questions related to land use changes, and questions related to pollution. And this is what we do in our research group called the Environmental Change Research Centre. We have many projects related to these kind of questions and different drivers. So I hope that this has given you a flavour of what we do. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I'll leave it at there.